Hi everyone, this is Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network, and since it's Sunday, that means I finally made it to my 19th birthday, so that's an exciting way to start my morning. But I wanted to share a live chess game that I played, and I actually was recording the game live. Unfortunately, the recording didn't go through, so this is my second attempt. But this is an exciting game for me because I was playing someone about my rating, and on ICC, if I had won the game, then I break 2,000 on the G15 rating list for ICC, which I had never done before. So personally, for me, this game was kind of meaningful, and unfortunately, you didn't get to see the game happen live, but I decided to re-record this analysis rather than try again because I thought this game was really instructive and tied in with my article that came out on Friday about how you should react to opponents who don't exactly follow your theory or your understanding of the position, or make moves that seem kind of counterintuitive in the opening, but aren't necessarily losing. How to go about explaining those. And I think I had a really good game here that could help explain that. So I'm playing with the black pieces, and we chose the Sicilian, and there's nothing strange here, but then my opponent chose the move b3. And I'm aware of lines where white plays b3 on move 2 before committing the knight to c3, but I'd never seen b3 after the move knight to c3. And for me, this already was a little bit out of my opening theory because, well, just naturally, it doesn't seem like white should be countering this long diagonal when black is obviously going to get to it first, and should have reasonable play. And furthermore, I thought my thought process are, well, what are the critical squares that black is playing for in this position? And, in reality, if we assume that maybe white takes some sort of close Sicilian setup after this, maybe a move like f4, g3, bishop g2, knight to f3, black is ultimately fighting for the d4 square. So my placement of the bishop on g7 is very natural. Whereas white, okay, he has the bishop on b2. Let's assume like he can get steady control over the long square diagonal. But what square is exactly the gold mine for white? And the honest truth is there isn't exactly one, because black can easily get control over all the critical dark squares in the position. So for me, this was a line that I never studied because it just seemed kind of counterintuitive to what white should be doing, considering black is such a natural stronghold over this diagonal. But okay, white plays the move bishop b2, and I'm sure if you put this position in a computer, it may or may not be plus or minus 0.5, maybe minus, but in reality, to a human, it's hard to say like this position is winning for black from here, right? Like, this isn't a blunder. So, as a black player here, I have to come up with a natural plan to kind of help me progress the position. I chose to move knight to c6, with the idea that I'm still continuing to play for the d4 square. My opponent can't really surprise me. This is the least committal move. I haven't really decided any of my pawns yet. And should my opponent play bishop to b5, I can play this move knight to d4, and I should be fine. So this was the move that I believed was the most flexible. And so my opponent chose the move bishop to c4. And this was definitely out of any sort of knowledge I had previously of this e4, b3 Sicilian line, because this bishop is poorly placed against the fianchettoed bishop here because it can't retreat backwards, and that's going to be a problem for it later in the game. And so here, I had to do a little bit of thinking here. What pawn move should I make here? And at first I thought, okay, maybe d6 might come in handy, and I'm sure it's a perfectly good move. But I wanted to make a move that didn't really commit to anything because, d6, it can lend itself to play e5, but if my opponent plays f4, then I'm not sure if e5 is the best plan anymore, and then I'm committing to a move like e6. And at some point I want to play d5, so why play d6? So in this position, I knew that I wanted to have a structure that was conducive to doing something. I also wanted to eliminate any threat of f7. So by playing this move e6, I thought I did a good job of eliminating the activity of both bishops, because this bishop on b2 is really subdued by my g7 bishop, and this bishop on c4 no longer has a clear purpose. So my opponent played the knight to f3, and this was, of all the moves he's played so far, I think the worst. And it seems really counterintuitive. White should want a castle, white should want to develop naturally, but I think here white missed the fine lining, which was if you wanted to play for any sort of initiative, you really need to play for f4. The idea being not necessarily to push to f5 immediately or to push to e5, but just to have like this natural hold over the center. At some point, I want to play d5 and control this side of the center. White should try to do the same. If I play a move like knight on g to e7, he can play knight to f3. We're both going to castle. And, I don't like white's position because of this fianchetto, and I think it's kind of sluggish. And white lacks the ability to play for like bishop to h6 like a regular close Sicilian. But I'm sure this is totally playable. So if we go back, I thought when my opponent played this move knight to f3, he really missed out on an opportunity to get some quality play in. So I played knight to g to e7. My opponent castled. And, I knew I wanted to play d5, but here if I play d5, I might not be worse, but why risk having my king up in the center of the position? My opponent can play a move like bishop to b5 followed by rook to e1, and there's really no need to even consider this complication when my opponent can't even stop the move d5 at all. So I just played castle here, which was a very natural move. My opponent played a4. And, my opponent on ICC was rated about like 1930, 1940. For G15, that's a reasonably strong rating. But unfortunately, I think that this move is a positional mistake. And the reason why is, I think White's trying to assume that I'm going to go for some sort of Sicilian Khan or Sicilian Najdorf structure where I play the pawn to a6 and then b5. So this move, in his mind, is a prophylactic measure to stop me from playing for b5. With 1, 2, 3 defenders of the b5 square, it would just be really time-consuming to play a6, rook to b8, and then find another way to get b5 rolling. But this move a4 weakens this b4 square. Furthermore, it weakens some of the dark squares in his position. And, I wasn't sure if maybe White wanted to play bishop to a3, but he didn't really need to play a4 to play this move. And furthermore, putting the bishop on a3 really weakens his dark squares. And this becomes a key theme later when my opponent does choose to go for this move. I think maybe a more natural move would have been to try to find a more effective way to get space for this light squared bishop. With the move d5 coming in, it's really clear that my opponent has to move this bishop, and I'm not confident that I can find an accurate way for White to play safely. It'd be really nice if he could really move like d4, but that's just not possible, and a move like d3 really traps the white bishop, and he runs a risk of it being stuck. And, as I said, with the bishop to c4 move, this isn't an accurate move because it's outside of the pawn structure for White. And, for White, it'd be really nice if he could have a fluid pawn structure. And this is a very fluid pawn structure in the sense that there's no weaknesses. It's hard to create any weaknesses for Black. And it's just solid. But the problem is with having the bishop on the outside, it's almost like having a bad bishop, with the exception of being you're almost inside the pawn chain from the opposite direction, where the bishop would even be better here on e2 than it is serving on c4. So this is why this bishop to c4 move was a little bit of an inaccuracy. But okay, my opponent played a4, and I went ahead and continued with my plan. d5, takes, and bishop to g5, b5 rather. And this was the first real critical point of the game. When I had played d5, my original intention was to control the center and open up my my light square diagonal for my bishop, so that way I could get activity going. And this was the first point where I really saw an opportunity to fight for that d4 square, which I had mentioned before. And if I can pin this knight on f3, then I can put a piece on d4. So I played the move bishop to g4, and my opponent played h3, which honestly I think was a little bit of a mistake. But if we go back for a quick second and play the move that I think that White should have played, bishop takes c6, this move knight takes c6, and it's really hard to stop this move knight d4 from coming in. This knight really can't move to a really good square. If it goes to b5, I'll play a6. And if it goes to e2, I'll take on f3 and double pawns on White's kingside, so that's not exactly desirable. Not to mention this bishop on b2 would be hanging because then I can't get to a4 d1. So already my opponent has to deal with this fact of this knight getting to d4. If he plays this move h3, takes, I'll play knight to d4. With the c2 pawn weak, my opponent has to choose the awkward queen d3 or concede that he's lost the tempo with the move queen to d1. And okay, I'm not winning yet, but I'm definitely slightly better. My opponent's wasted tempi, and if anyone's come out better of the opening, it's Black, because I have control over the dark square diagonal, as I knew I would from the beginning of the game. I have control over the center. My queen can go to d6, connect my rooks, and it's not quite clear how White's going to deal with this weakness. A move like rook to c1 to protect c2 to then move the queen seems a little bit tedious, and it's not quite clear where the queen could go if this was the plan. So I knew I would be better here, but my opponent made a mistake that I thought really cost him a lot of material. So h3, and this move seems like a natural move, but the problem for him is after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3. I had calculated after knight to d4, this queen to d3 move, because if my opponent plays queen to d1, well, he's conceding the fact that he's lost a tempo here. But this queen to d3 move allows me to play this move a6. And this is why I think it was so important to insert this with bishop takes c6, was because this bishop on b5 doesn't really have any squares it can go to without losing material. And because of this, and when my opponent has to play queen d1, it opens up a whole lot of ideas for me to try to attack this b5 bishop. Once I realize that once the queen went to d3, the bishop is trapped. So okay, my opponent played queen to d1, and here I decided to take a measure that I hadn't originally seen when going for this bishop g4 plan, but it became really apparent once I saw this idea that the bishop really lacks a lot of squares, and that was this move, that was the move c4. And the idea behind c4 is that if my opponent takes a pawn, which is seemingly hanging, he runs into the problem that with both of these pawns on light squares, this bishop has officially run out of time. After takes, I can take on a1. My opponent can take queen or bishop, probably bishop to protect c2, and then I pick up another pawn, and I'm just up a piece here. So my opponent's already in a little bit of trouble here because there's no way to really salvage this bishop, and I think my opponent finds the only resource. And this was actually a move that I didn't see when I originally played c4, but at the same time, I think it's because this move is actually really weakening, and that's the move bishop to a3. And as I mentioned before, the move a4 created some dark squared weaknesses for white, particularly the a3, b2, a1, c3 squares. But this move, by moving the bishop away from the long diagonal, really weakens this diagonal tactically for white. And here I had to make a decision, and I realized if I try to go for the same a6 idea, I'm not actually trapping the bishop, because after bishop takes e7, this move is forced, and after bishop takes d5, if I try to pick up a piece, thinking I'm forking, bishop takes c4, and in actuality, I'm the one who's losing now, and I'm down by 2 pawns, and, you know, even if I can pick up this rook somehow without having to give up 2 minor pieces, this is a very uphill battle for me. So, this is not a possibility, but at the same time, what could be? Well, I can't really play a move like rook to e8, because obviously this light squared bishop can take on e8, and this light squared bishop is a bad bishop. My opponent, if he can trade up, or for the same amount of material, for this bishop in b5, for example, he would be more than happy if I played the move knight takes b5, because this bishop has no future. So a move like rook to e8 is kind of counterintuitive. But then I started thinking, okay, what are my opponent's weakest squares? And if you think about it, they're all really dark squares, whether it's the queen side or this diagonal from g1 to a7. They're both dark squares, so with only one file open on the board, I made what I thought was a rational decision, which was to play knight to f5. The idea being that once my opponent takes, which he did in the game, I can take it back, bishop takes f8, I'm still threatening this move a6, my bishop can come to c5, control this diagonal, and even if my opponent gets in this move rook to e1, I should be fine. I have a lot of pieces, I'm more active, my opponent's queen is bunkered down to the c2 pawn, which is a real weakness, so I was relatively pleased with this position. Now, what was white's best move? White's best move might have actually been to play this move a5, because the pawn's not hanging, because after queen takes a5, I actually lose a rook here. So if I play a move like a6, my opponent has an escape square for the bishop. But I have to believe, even here, these two bishops, even though they break down on the king's side, you know, this bishop doesn't have any squares it can actually go to. This bishop can take on f8, but as we established, my opponent's weakest squares are dark squares, so it's not exactly like it's a true being up in exchange. Here, I would probably play a move like queen to g5, and I have to believe that I have reasonable compensation for any sort of material loss if my opponent takes an f8. So this might have been my opponent's best try, but you know, bishop takes f8 can't be that wrong either. I took on f8 with the bishop, and this was the important move because the bishop on g7, even though it's on a really good diagonal, I really want it to be on this diagonal to attack the king. If my opponent tries to play like f4 or anything, or f3, I can put my bishop on c5, but also at the same time, it's a much more active square. It's not really clear what I can do on this diagonal yet. So bishop takes f8. My opponent played the move rook to e1 with the threat of rook to e8. So if the rook can come down here, it skewers my queen to my rook, and I'm losing material. And I really don't want to trade my queen for a rook and a bishop after already having gone down the exchange. And at first, during my recording of the live game, my initial reaction was to play a move like bishop to e7. But already I have to believe that this move is losing because the bishop is pinned to the e8 square, because rook to e8 is still a possibility. And it's kind of just awkward placement. I still have to move my pieces around. I haven't solved my problems. And a move like knight to e7 would also be bad because that defeats the whole purpose for having sacked the exchange in the first place. The whole point for sacrificing the exchange was to have more activity. So in reality, I have to think beyond this idea of protecting the 8 square and rather making a dynamic move. And that move for me was the move queen to g5. Because in this position I realized, well, okay, if my opponent trades off, this bishop on e8 will never become anything. This bishop is just as stuck as it was here as it was on b5. And even if I don't win the piece, it's the time it's taken for it to get to here and not do anything has cost white in the sense that he really can't develop. Already we can see like my knights are better than his one knight, his rook isn't developed, and my bishop is ready to get in the game. Meanwhile, my opponent's queen on d1 is stuck protecting his pawn on c2. So I was more than happy with this trade, and if I ever play a6, my opponent getting this e8 square for my opponent's bishop isn't really a game changer for me for the same reasons as stated before. So my opponent's already in a lot of trouble, and it's not quite clear exactly how he'll defend, because a move like g3, I can still play a move like knight to h4, and that's f3 square becomes really weak. And, even here, it's not quite clear how to guard this f3 square because the king is pinned. A move like king to h2 would lose immediately to bishop d6, so this isn't possible. A move like king to h1 may be the best defense, but after a move like knight to h4, g3 becomes immediately uncomfortable because of knight on h to f3. So if we go back, and let's assume my opponent plays a move like rook to g1, my opponent's position is just really passive here. It's not quite clear what he can do here. This bishop's still trapped. And here, the move I believe that wins, that I found in my analysis of the game after the fact, was this move queen to f5. I'm attacking c2, and I'm threatening a6. I can't play a6 immediately here because of this move bishop to d7, but now I'm actually trapping this bishop. Knight takes d5 is obviously not possible, and this move still traps the bishop. But I also threaten this nice move, knight on h to f3, which I can't actually move right now. Let's make a nothing move for white. Knight on h to f3 with the idea that if my opponent takes, I have checkmate, which would be slightly problematic. And if my opponent doesn't take, then I have a really nice knight on this square. My opponent still has weaknesses. It's not quite clear how he's going to, do anything about it. I could also go in with the other rook, with the idea that if my opponent moves his rook away, I can still put my queen back on g5, threaten checkmate, and the position would be reasonably awkward for my opponent. So my opponent actually resigned when I played the move queen to g5, and the game was over in 16 moves. And even though maybe my opponent has some life and should play on, it's not really quite clear what can happen. I haven't really looked at this game in an engine yet because I just finished playing this game. But it's hard to find moves for white. If he tries to save this bishop with bishop d7, I have knight to h4. I'm threatening knight to f3, which is a nasty fork, and I'm also threatening checkmate. So he can't. This bishop can't even come back to defend the g2 square for checkmate. And in this position, I would have to say my opponent's doomed to lose material. And I had calculated lines like even here, where if like my opponent takes some d5, which was maybe the only way to try to exploit this queen to g5 move. After knight to h4, this knight's under attack. This checkmate is under attack, so my opponent has to play a move like knight to e3. And now my opponent's already running into some trouble after a move like knight to f3. I can take on e1. The c2 pawn still could be a liability. I can play a6 followed by rook to e8. I just really don't like my opponent's position. I really think that I have a lot of compensation here. I'm at least getting my exchange back with some. So if my opponent, I don't know, plays king to f1 here, I can take, queen takes. I can't take yet, obviously, because of this, but I can definitely take here, so that way I'm not losing a pawn there. And then my bishop's going to come into c5. I can threaten the knight on e3. I really like what I have here, and I think that this, in and of itself, is a definite advantage. Obviously, if my opponent takes, I can grab a pawn, and if we just do a quick pawn count, even though material's even, I have the bishop, my opponent has the knight, my opponent's really passive, I'm going to win this b3 pawn at some point because it's isolated, and once my opponent plays a move like king to g1, I can pin the d pawn to the queen and follow it up with rook to d8, and this pawn on d2 is really weak, this pawn on b3 is really weak. I don't really see how my opponent's getting any effective compensation. For example, if he tries to get out of the pin, this move in and of itself looks just devastating. And it's clear that only black has winning chances here. So definitely, this variation shows resignation is probably premature, but with the amount of time trouble that my opponent was in, this being a g15 game, I definitely, understand why my opponent made the choice that he did. But I hope that if you maybe didn't fully grasp my article on Friday, which was this concept about talking about your dream positions, looking for ideas that you can, put into place because your opponent didn't make the most accurate moves in the opening, really makes more sense now in this game where my opponent, he chose a line that was definitely offbeat, and that within that line he made some moves that I definitely didn't agree with or wasn't aware of. And, even though I didn't know theory, I made it look, I wouldn't want to say simple, but I kind of broke it down into concepts that help me understand the position better. And I think that in and of itself is the most important thing when handling openings that you're not the most familiar with. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully next time I do a live chess game, you guys can get the recording live rather than me having to re-record because the sound didn't work. But this is Steincamp signing off from the Chess Summit Network, and hoping that you have a great weekend.